The iPad 2 and iPad 4 are among the greatest iPads ever made, and they played a very significant role in shaping the modern world of tablets as we know it today. With both being created in the classic era of iPads, which lasted from around 2011 to 2012, they kickstarted the most popular tablet in the world, and without them, the tech industry today would have been altered greatly. The iPad 2 and 4 appear almost identical on the surface, yet in pretty much every other aspect, there's not an ounce of similarity. Hello everyone, welcome back to TechSpree, and I hope you're all doing well. Today, we're going to be doing something a little different. Not a worth it in 2020 video, but more of a history lesson and a comparison of two old iPads that were given the exact same design, yet apart from that, they couldn't be more different. But before we get into that, I'd just like to announce that I made a Patreon, and so if you'd like to support this channel, it only starts at $1, and apart from helping out my small channel, you also get some pretty cool exclusive benefits. The link for that will be in the description, so if you could show some support, I would really appreciate that. Now back to the iPads. Because of their identical appearance, it's so easy to confuse these two devices, and to the average Joe, they're pretty much the same thing, an old obsolete iPad. So today, I'm going to be showing you just how different these tablets are to each other. So right off the bat, both of these iPads were sold as flagships when they first came out. The iPad 2 was released on the 2nd of March 2011, whereas the iPad 4 was released on the 2nd of November 2012. So there is about a year and a half of difference between them. Now there was actually an iPad released in between these two dates called the iPad 3, which debuted on March 7th, 2012, but its only real upgrade from the iPad 2 was a very minor spec bump, and I feel that it is not relevant for this comparison. The iPad 2 started at $579 for the 16GB Wi-Fi variant and peaked at $949 for the 64GB cellular version. The iPad 4, however, had a starting price of $539 for the 16GB Wi-Fi model and had a maximum price of $899 for the 64GB cellular version. So the iPad 4 actually sold for slightly less, and this was because Apple was trying to make the iPad more affordable and therefore more widespread. So next, let's cover their design. Both iPads sport the same classic Steve Jobs era looks with the silver aluminium curved body. They're basically identical, apart from a few minute details in the dimensions and a different charging port, and you could easily fool a non-tech-savvy person into thinking one was the other. For the iPad 2, you had a height of 141.2mm, a width of 185.7mm, a depth of 8.8mm, and a weight of 601 grams for Wi-Fi or 613 grams for the cellular variant. As for the iPad 4, it sports a height of 241.2mm, a width of 185.7mm, a depth of 9.4mm, and weighs 652 grams for the Wi-Fi version and 662 grams for the cellular model. So basically, the iPad 2 is actually the thinner and lighter device here, although this is partly because the iPad 4's battery is actually twice the size of the iPad 2's. Now in terms of displays, both sport a 9.7-inch LCD, but it's here that we start to notice some key differences. The iPad 2 offers a grisly non-retina display with a resolution of 768 by 1024 at 132 ppi, whereas the iPad 4 uses a 1536 by 2048 resolution retina display at 264 ppi. Now if you're confused by all the random numbers I just spat out, then fear not, because I'm going to try my best to explain this madness. Basically what this means is that the iPad 2 has a very low quality display compared to the iPad 4. It's not retina, which means that the pixel density is far below the mark where you can discern individual pixels, and it looks really choppy and pixelated. Videos and pictures will look blurry, and you're not really getting that same crisp image from that of a retina display. It might look good on this video, but trust me, in person, it's a whole nother story. Now Apple could have actually put a retina display on there if they'd wanted to, because the iPhone 4 had one the previous year, but it's probably a good idea that they didn't, and I'll explain why later. In contrast, the iPad 4 sports an excellent retina display and is very high quality. You can't see pixels unless you're looking really closely, and everything you're viewing looks amazing. In fact, just to give you an idea of how good of a display this is, the majority of modern iPads actually use the same pixel density, such as the iPad Air 3 and the iPad Pro 4th gen. So we've actually got a noticeable difference already here. The iPad 2 packs a very low quality non-retina display, whereas the iPad 4 screen was a massive improvement, and everything just looks really nice on it. The two devices share the thick by modern standards bezels around their displays, along with the front-facing camera and the old non-Touch ID home buttons. Touch ID actually wasn't introduced until 2013, so it's no surprise that it's a feature that both of these iPads lacked. The sides of both iPads have quite a deep curve to them, and this makes them really easy to hold. On the left-hand sides we get nothing, and on the right there's the old plastic volume rocker below the toggle switch. The top of the iPad 2 and 4 houses the power button and something many nostalgic people will appreciate, a headphone jack. Then in the middle there is a small microphone for FaceTiming and video recording, etc. Now the bottom of both of these iPads is actually one of the only areas of difference between them. The bottom of the iPad 2 contains the speaker as well as the old 30-pin connector to charge the battery. On the other hand, the iPad 4 charges via Lightning, and it was the first iPad to make the switch from the 30-pin connector. This was a massive upgrade as 30-pin chargers were big, inconvenient, and would commonly break, but the Lightning charger solved all of this. They were portable, went in any way, and were a lot more durable. Oh yeah, and the speaker grill seen on both iPads also looks the same, can't forget about that. On the rear, everything is basically the same, with the smooth aluminium surface and the glassy Apple logo, which was the norm back in the Steve Jobs era. The only real difference difference I'd say is the camera size. I mean, just look at how tiny the camera is on the iPad 2 compared to the iPad 4. It's not that noticeable, but if you look closely you'll be able to tell that these are two different devices by examining the rear camera. So as I've said many times before in this video, the iPad 2 and 4 are pretty much identical on the outside, apart from the fact that they use different ports to charge and a few differences in the screen quality. But when it comes to their internals, it's a whole different story. Now the most significant difference internally lies between the processors of these two devices. They're only a year apart, yet they set very different courses for these iPads in the long run. The iPad 2 is powered by Apple's A5 chipset, which was awesome at the time and was centuries ahead of the first iPad in terms of speed, but this affected it very badly in the long run. Apple made the mistake of supporting this device for too long, from iOS 5 until iOS 9, and if you're a fan of Apple, you'll most likely already know this story. This update was too much for the iPad 2's processor to handle, and it made everything excruciatingly slow and pretty much borderline unusable. I mean, sure, Apple's devices do slow down over the years as they get updated, and an at the time 4-year-old tablet would never match the performance of a new one, but this is by far the worst case of it. Any task is modern torture on an iPad 2 running iOS 9, whether it be YouTube, a game, or even setting a reminder. Whatever it may be, iOS 9 completely screwed over this tablet, and for something so innovative in its day, it didn't deserve such a terrible fate. In fact, pretty much any device with the A5 or A5X chipset is in the same boat. I'm talking about the iPhone 4S, the iPad 3, the iPad 2, iPad mini 1st gen, and the iPod Touch 5th gen. This iPad here is unfortunately running it, and as you can see, I have also cracked it because I am an idiot. Like, I've literally owned this thing for 7 years now, and it's been through multiple drops, multiple incidents of abuse, and this morning it just decided to crack on me. So that's kind of disappointing. I thought this was indestructible. Now, it's not all the processor's fault, but the measly 512 megabytes of RAM also struggled in running the new update. It was too little to keep iOS 9 running smoothly, and all of these devices should have stayed on iOS 8. Now, iOS 8 actually did run this device down pretty significantly, but when it was given iOS 9, it was a complete disaster. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was a good idea that the iPad 2 didn't have a Retina display, and that relates to the issue in the fact that the processor would have to push way more pixels and would have destroyed the performance even more, and that is something I don't even want to think about, so let's talk about the iPad 4's far less catastrophic end. The iPad 4, on the other hand, is run by Apple's dual-core A6X chipset with quad-core graphics. This chip is 1 year newer than the A5 and is a vast improvement. It allowed the iPad 4 to perform quite well throughout its lifespan, and even on its final version, it's actually quite bearable. The A6X chipset was able to support the iPad 4 from iOS 6 all the way to iOS 10. This is 1 year ahead of the iPad 2, and while it's not really a fast device now, it's a whole world of difference to the iPad 2 on iOS 9. So not only was the iPad 4 able to get an extra year of software support, but the iPad 4's performance on its final version is actually okay. Like, not fast by any means, it still struggles quite a bit, but it's many leagues ahead of the iPad 2 on iOS 9. Pretty much anything is, actually. Something else that really differs greatly between the iPad 2 and the iPad 4 is the cameras. This is another area where the iPad 4 greatly outdoes the iPad 2, although it is basically impossible to be beaten by the camera on the iPad 2. The iPad 2 was actually the first iPad to get a camera, as the first generation, released a year earlier, didn't have one. It sports a stunning, clear and crispy 0.7 megapixel camera on the rear, and a movie studio quality 0.3 megapixel camera on the front. Now, I'm obviously joking here. The iPad 2's cameras were absolutely horrendous, even for 2011. Some say that these are the worst cameras ever made by Apple, and even the original iPhone from 2007 kind of outdoes it in terms of specs because it's got a full 2 megapixels as opposed to 0.7 on the iPad 2. This camera is a disaster and doesn't do a good job at capturing anything, even in good lighting. Images are blurry, washed out, and even for 2011 this was pretty sloppy. And don't even get me started on zooming in, because if you do, you won't even be able to tell what's going on in your shot, as seen by this disaster. The video is also terrible, although it is capable of 720p at 30 frames a second. It feels more like 20p though, and everything looks just as shocking as the photos, although it is actually kind of stable, so I'll give it that. Now, I actually used this camera a lot back in primary school to film really cringy videos, but again, young me didn't really know or care that literally every other camera that I had access to was a million times better. Still though, please don't use this camera for anything. Like, literally anything else you can find will be a million times better. The iPad 4, on the other hand, is so much better at taking videos and photos, and packs a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera with face detection and a 5 megapixel rear sensor with autofocus. This is a much improved camera, and although it's not actually great, it can capture some okay shots if the lighting is good. The iPad 4 camera feels like it's 10 years newer than the iPad 2's, rather than only one, since it's so much sharper and detailed. It can also shoot at 1080p at 30 frames a second, which feels like a breath of fresh air compared to the iPad 2. I mean, sure, there's a lot of room for improvement by today's standards, but this was pretty good for 2012. So similar would be the last word I'd use to describe the cameras on the iPad 2 and 4. I mean, they're not even in the same league as each other, as the iPad 2's cameras were absolute potatoes. They should have put the camera from the iPhone 4 or 4S on it, considering that this was a flagship device, and they definitely could have if they wanted to. On the other hand though, this was the first iPad to even have a camera on it, so it was never going to be perfect either. The iPad 4's camera is a big step up, however, and while it can't take studio perfect shots, it got the job done fine for 2012. The last thing worth comparing about these two devices is the battery life. The iPad 2 sports a 6,930 mAh battery, whereas the iPad 4 contains a whopping 11,560 mAh battery. This is close to more than double that of the iPad 2, although Apple claims that both can get 10 hours out of a charge. I actually haven't noticed a difference between these two iPads, but they both last a heck of a long time. I'd also like to point out that I used the iPad 2 heavily for about 4 years, and so the battery would have had time to degrade, but despite this, it still holds an amazing charge, and I'd say that the use time is probably over 10 hours. Same for the iPad 4, although this was actually purchased by my parents a few years ago and used really briefly, and then it was stored in a container for a really long time. The battery on that thing still lasts over 10 hours, but that's understandable because it was only used really lightly. I'd say that an amazing battery life is something that these two tablets share in common, but mine are still doing so well when it comes to battery life. So that pretty much wraps up my comparison of the iPad 2 and the iPad 4. The iPad 2 was an innovative tablet that was a massive step up from the first generation iPad and brought a lot of new features like a camera for the first time on an iPad. It's too bad, however, that Apple gave it such a terrible fate with iOS 9 because it completely destroyed the performance and made it basically unusable. The iPad 4 was the final iPad to carry the design of the Steve Jobs era and was a vast improvement to the iPad 2 in every possible aspect. Yes, it is a year newer than the two, but for 1 year so much had improved. From the camera to the performance to the battery life, it was just a really big step up, and if you ever owned one of these, you probably won't have many negative things to say about it. So in conclusion, the iPad 2 and 4 may look identical on the outside, but internally, they're worlds apart and there's very little in common between the two. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to TechSpree and turning on that notification bell so that you never miss any new uploads whenever I have the time to post. Be sure to drop me a like as well, and share this channel with your friends to show some support. My social medias are also in the description below, so you should go follow them for some behind the scenes stuff and some polls that I post on my Instagram story regarding what video I post next. That's all from me today, and I'll see you next week. Or next time I have time to post.